Please, I'm injured. I can't walk." The female CEO cried, then a single dad changed everything. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. The night was cold and heavy with rain, the kind that made the air sting and the road shine like a sheet of black glass. Ethan Miller squinted through his cracked windshield, the wipers fighting to keep up. His old Ford truck rattled along the mountain road, its heater barely working, the dashboard lit with a dim orange glow. On the passenger seat sat a worn lunchbox and a tiny pink backpack, his daughter Sophie's. He was late getting home after a 12-hour shift at the repair shop, and all he could think about was her sleepy voice asking if he'd read her a story. Then, through the curtain of rain, his headlights caught something, a car, half tilted off the shoulder, hazard lights blinking weakly. For a second, he thought to keep driving. People around here didn't stop at night. It wasn't safe. But then he saw her, a woman slumped against the steering wheel, her hand pressed to her leg, blood mixing with rainwater. Ethan's stomach dropped. He hit the brakes, threw the truck in park, and ran into the storm. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he shouted. The woman's head turned, her voice barely audible over the downpour. "Please, I'm injured. I can't walk." Her words trembled more from shock than cold. Ethan knelt beside her, the mud soaking through his jeans. "Don't move. I'll get you out." She winced as he unbuckled the seatbelt. The luxury car reeked of burnt rubber and perfume. Her ankle was twisted badly. Her designer heel snapped in half. "My phone," she whispered. He shook his head. "No signal up here. We'll have to get you to shelter." Without another thought, he slid his arms under her and lifted her from the seat. She gasped, part pain, part disbelief. "You don't have to." "Yeah, I do," he said simply. The rain pounded harder as he carried her across the slick road toward his truck. His coat clung to her shoulders, heavy with water. She shivered against his chest but said nothing. He eased her into the passenger seat, adjusted the heater, and shut the door. Her face was pale, framed by dark hair plastered to her cheeks. Even through the rain and exhaustion, Ethan noticed the subtle grace in her posture, the way her hands trembled not from fear but from control slipping away. She wasn't just anyone. "Name's Ethan," he said, starting the engine. "We'll get you warm first, then figure out the rest." She nodded weakly. "Avery," she murmured. "Thank you." He didn't answer, only glanced once more at her reflection in the fogged-up window. Whoever this woman was, she wasn't built for nights like this. As the truck rumbled into the darkness, neither of them knew that this single act of kindness would change both their lives forever. The rain did not stop until dawn. Ethan's truck groaned as it climbed the last mile of dirt road that led to his small cabin. By the time they reached it, the world outside was silver with mist. Avery had fallen half asleep, her ankle swelling badly, her clothes drenched. Ethan parked under the tin awning, jumped out, and opened her door. "We are here," he said quietly. She blinked, disoriented, glancing at the modest cabin surrounded by pines. It was nothing like the glass towers or marble lobbies she was used to. "You live here?" she asked softly. "Yeah, it is not much, but it is warm." He helped her out, steadying her when she tried to stand. The pain shot through her leg, and she gasped. Without a word, he lifted her again, carried her through the door, and set her gently on an old couch near the fireplace. The cabin smelled of pine wood, coffee, and faint motor oil. Sophie's drawings were pinned to the wall, stick figures, rainbows, a dog with a heart above it. Avery looked around, surprised by the warmth in such a humble place. Ethan crouched near the fire, stacking wood and striking a match. Flames came to life, casting a golden glow over his face. "You will need to get those wet clothes off soon," he said, handing her a folded blanket. "There is a first aid kit in the kitchen drawer." She nodded, wrapping the blanket around herself. Her voice was hoarse. "Thank you for helping me. You really did not have to." Ethan shrugged, pouring water into a pot for coffee. "If I were the one stuck out there, I would hope someone would stop." Avery watched him move, rough hands, calm presence. It had been a long time since anyone had helped her without asking what was in it for them. She pressed her fingers to the locket that hung from her neck, realizing it was gone. "My necklace," she murmured. Ethan turned, frowning. "You lost it?" It must have fallen in the car, she said, trying to hide her panic. That locket carried a photo of her parents, the only piece of her old life untouched by business or betrayal. Ethan caught her expression but said nothing. I will check when the rain stops, he said simply. Right now you should rest. When Sophie woke up, she rubbed her sleepy eyes and peeked into the living room. Daddy? Who is that? She whispered. She is a friend who got hurt, Ethan replied. Sophie patted closer, curious. Hi, I am Sophie. Do you want my stuffed bear? He makes people feel better. Avery blinked, touched by the little girl's sincerity. Thank you, sweetheart. I think your bear might be magical. Sophie grinned and handed it to her before running to get breakfast. Avery smiled for the first time in months. It felt strange, soft, unfamiliar. Later, while Ethan cooked scrambled eggs on the stove, Avery tried to stand but winced in pain. You should not move, he said firmly. You will make it worse. She sighed. I am used to giving orders, not taking them. Ethan chuckled. Then maybe this is good practice. She looked at him curiously. You do not talk like someone who works in the city. I do not. Used to be a mechanic down in Denver, he said, sliding a plate toward her. Lost my shop when the bills piled up after my wife passed. Been fixing cars from home since. His tone was matter of fact, but his eyes carried a quiet weight. Avery hesitated. I am sorry. Do not be, he said. Sophie keeps me going. That is enough. For a moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Avery took a bite, realizing she had not eaten since yesterday. The food was simple but tasted better than anything she could remember. This is good, she said. You sure you are not secretly a chef? He smiled. Nope, just a dad who learned how not to burn breakfast. She laughed softly, surprising herself again. There was something disarming about him, no judgment, no pretense, just steady kindness. When the rain eased, Ethan grabbed his jacket. I will head back and check your car, see if I can find that necklace. You really do not have to. I know, he interrupted gently. But I want to. As he stepped outside, Avery watched from the window. She did not know who this man really was or why his quiet decency unsettled her so much. For the first time in years, the woman who led boardrooms and signed million-dollar contracts felt small, human, and safe. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the mountain air crisp and clean. Sunlight streamed through the windows, catching dust motes that danced in the warmth. Avery sat on the couch with Sophie, the little girl showing her how to draw a flower with a broken crayon. Every few minutes, Avery's gaze drifted to the door, waiting for the sound of Ethan's truck. When it finally rumbled into the driveway, she felt an unfamiliar rush of relief. Ethan stepped inside, hair damp from the morning dew, holding something in his hand. Found this wedged under the seat, he said, placing the silver locket on the table. Avery's breath caught. You found it? She whispered, clutching it tightly. Thank you. Looked important, he said. It is, she murmured. It is the only thing that has been with me through everything. Ethan noticed the way her fingers lingered on the locket, the way her eyes softened as if they saw another time. He wanted to ask, but did not. Instead, he poured her coffee and sat across from her. How is the leg? Better, she said. Still hurts, but at least I can move it. He nodded approvingly. I can drive you to town this afternoon. Get it looked at properly. Avery hesitated. Maybe later. I am not ready to go back yet. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Back where? She looked down at her cup, avoiding his eyes. Back to everything. The truth hovered in her throat, but she swallowed it. Right now, I just want to breathe. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. You can stay as long as you need. The words were simple, but they felt like a gift. Over the next 2 days, the cabin settled into a quiet rhythm. Ethan worked outside repairing an old generator, while Avery helped Sophie with homework, balancing the little girl's workbook on her knee. She found herself laughing more, sleeping deeper, and waking up to the sound of birds instead of her assistant's reminders. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the pines, Ethan grilled chicken on the porch. Avery stepped out, leaning on the doorframe, her crutches tucked under one arm. Smells good, she said. Do you always cook like this? He chuckled. Only when someone is here to appreciate it. She smiled faintly. I cannot remember the last time I had dinner without my phone buzzing every minute. Maybe you should forget where you left it, he said lightly. She laughed, and the sound surprised them both. Later, after Sophie had gone to bed, they sat by the fire outside. The night was quiet except for the soft chirping of crickets. Avery stared into the flames, her voice low. "You ever feel like you built a life that looks perfect on the outside but hollow inside?" Ethan glanced at her. "Every day before I lost my wife. After that I figured out what really matters. A roof that does not leak, food on the table, someone who cares if you come home or not." Avery nodded slowly, the reflection of the fire dancing in her eyes. "I used to think success meant control, but now I am not so sure." Ethan looked at her curiously. "What did you do before all this?" She hesitated, searching for the right answer. "I ran things, big things. It does not matter right now." He did not press further. "Well," he said softly, "whatever you ran, you are welcome to run this place until that leg heals." She smiled, touched by his easy kindness. Before going to bed, Avery paused at Sophie's door. The little girl was asleep, her arm wrapped around the stuffed bear. For a moment, Avery's chest tightened. She had everything: power, money, a name that opened doors, but she had never known peace like this tiny cabin offered. That night, as she lay under a quilt that smelled of cedar and soap, she whispered to herself, "I could stay here forever." But morning had its own plans. When she woke, the television was on, the news anchor's voice echoing through the living room. Breaking story: Avery Langford, CEO of Langford Group, remains missing after her car accident 3 days ago. Police suspect possible foul play. Ethan turned from the screen, stunned. Avery's eyes widened in shock as her secret hung in the air, no longer safe. The warmth of the cabin faded into silence. Ethan stared at her, his voice barely above a whisper. "You are Avery Langford?" She nodded slowly, guilt and fear flickering across her face. "I did not mean to lie," she said. "I just needed to be someone else for a while." Ethan stepped back, torn between anger and disbelief. "You should have told me." She lowered her head. "I wanted to, but you looked at me like a person, not a company. I could not lose that." The moment stretched between them, fragile and heavy with truth. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees as the world they had built in that cabin began to shift. Ethan stood in silence, the fire still flickering behind him, its glow casting long shadows across the room. Avery could not meet his eyes. The sound of the rain gutter dripping outside filled the space between them. "So that is who you really are," Ethan said quietly. "A missing CEO with a car that costs more than this house." Avery swallowed hard. "Yes, but I did not mean to deceive you. I just needed a place where I could breathe." Ethan shook his head slowly. "I do not care about your title, Avery, but I do care about the truth, and you should have trusted me with that." His voice was not angry, just tired. She took a deep breath, her leg throbbing beneath the blanket. "You are right," she said softly. "I am sorry." Sophie peeked from the hallway, her small voice trembling. "Daddy, are you mad at Miss Avery?" Ethan forced a faint smile. "No, sweetheart. Grown-ups just get confused sometimes." He turned back to Avery. "You should probably call your people. They are looking for you." She nodded, picking up the phone Ethan had left on the counter. When the call connected, a man's voice on the other end burst with panic and relief. "Miss Langford, thank God. Are you safe? We have been searching everywhere. The board is in chaos." "I am fine, Marcus," she said quietly. "Please send a car to pick me up. I will be ready in an hour." When she hung up, the silence returned. Ethan stood near the window, arms crossed. "So what happens now? You go back to your towers and I go back to fixing cars?" "I do not know," she said honestly. "But I wish it did not have to end like this." He gave a small nod, then walked outside to clear his head. Avery sat alone, staring at the locket in her hand. She felt foolish for believing that peace could exist outside her old world. When the black car arrived at the edge of the driveway, the driver rushed to help her with her bag. Avery looked around one last time, the little drawings on the wall, the smell of coffee, Sophie's laughter echoing faintly from her room. Ethan came out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. "Take care of yourself," he said, "and watch those mountain roads next time." She smiled sadly. "Thank you for everything, Ethan. For saving me. For reminding me what kindness looks like." He nodded once, his expression unreadable. As the car pulled away, Sophie ran to the porch and waved. "Bye, Miss Avery." Avery pressed her hand to the window, her eyes wet. The drive back to the city felt endless. Skyscrapers replaced trees, and the hum of traffic swallowed the quiet she had come to love. When the elevator doors opened to the top floor of Langford Group, cameras flashed, assistants rushed, and the air smelled of perfume and panic. Marcus, her head of operations, met her with a strained smile. "The press is going crazy. The investors want answers. You need to make a statement immediately." Avery's mind spun, but she nodded. "Schedule a press conference for tomorrow morning. I will address it myself." She limped to her office, ignoring the chaos around her. The city skyline stretched beyond the glass, a glittering cage she had built herself. Later that night, she opened the locket Ethan had found. Inside was the tiny photo of her parents and a folded scrap of paper he had slipped in. It read, "Do not lose yourself again." Her breath caught. The next morning she stood before a wall of reporters. Flashbulbs burst as she stepped to the podium. "I am grateful to be alive," she began. "But this accident has reminded me that life is not about status or control. It is about the people who remind us who we are when we forget." Her voice cracked slightly, but she steadied herself. Somewhere in the crowd of flashing lights, she thought she saw a familiar face, but it was only a trick of light. When the conference ended, Avery retreated to her office and closed the door. She stared out at the rain starting again against the glass, whispering to herself, "Maybe someday I will find a way to thank him properly." Back on the mountain, Ethan stood on his porch watching the same rain fall, the silence of the cabin feeling heavier without her laughter. Sophie tugged his sleeve. "Will she come back, Daddy?" Ethan looked down at his daughter and forced a gentle smile. "Maybe, sweetheart. Sometimes people find their way home in unexpected ways." He looked out at the dark road leading down the hill, the memory of Avery's smile lingering like a ghost of light in the rain. A month passed. The chaos of Avery's return had quieted, but something inside her had not. She moved through meetings, signed contracts, and smiled for cameras, yet every polished word felt hollow. At night, she would stand by her penthouse window, staring at the distant mountains where peace had once felt real. The locket rested on her desk beside that folded note from Ethan. She had read it so many times the ink had begun to fade. One evening, Marcus entered her office, holding a file. "You asked me to investigate the accident," he said, lowering his voice. "You were right. The brake lines were tampered with." Avery's heart pounded. "Do you know who did it?" Marcus hesitated. "It points to someone inside the company. The security footage from the garage shows a man using your clearance card." It was Derek Cole. Avery froze. Derek had been her late father's protege, her trusted chief financial officer. "He has been trying to take control of the board for months," Marcus added. "If you expose him, the stockholders will turn on him instantly." Avery clenched her jaw. "Prepare everything. I want this dealt with legally." That night she barely slept, her mind racing with betrayal and resolve. She realized Ethan's words had been more than comfort, they had been warning. "Do not lose yourself again." The next morning she called a full board meeting. Derek sat across from her, confident and smug. "Glad to see you are well, Avery," he said with a practiced smile. "The company needs stability." She met his gaze coolly. "You are right, Derek. That is why I have brought evidence of your attempt to kill me." The room fell silent. Gasps rippled through the boardroom as she pressed a button on the remote. Security footage flickered onto the screen, showing Derek entering the garage late at night, his face drained of color. "This is absurd," he shouted, standing up. "You cannot prove intent." Avery's voice was calm but sharp as glass. "The police can. They are waiting outside." Officers entered the room as Derek's protests turned into curses. The cameras captured every second as he was led away. Marcus exhaled, relief written all over his face. "You did it," he whispered. Avery looked out the window, her reflection overlapping the skyline. "No," she said softly, "we did it the right way." For the first time in years, she felt steady. But something else tugged at her, a quiet longing for that cabin, for the man who had seen her as more than a title. 2 weeks later, Langford Group launched a new initiative, a foundation to support single parents and working families. Avery called it Second Chances. When reporters asked why, she simply said, "Because kindness saved my life." On the day of the foundation's opening, the city's community center buzzed with cameras and guests. Avery stood on stage, elegant yet humble, as she addressed the crowd. "This program is not about charity," she said. "It is about opportunity for those who give and for those who receive." As she spoke, her eyes scanned the audience. not expecting to see him, and yet, at the back of the room, near the doors, stood Ethan. He looked almost out of place among the suits, his jacket neatly pressed, but his hands rough from work. Sophie held his hand tightly, her eyes wide with wonder. For a second, Avery lost her composure. She smiled softly, genuinely. After the event, she found him near the exit. "You came," she said, breathless. Ethan shrugged lightly. "Sophie saw your face on a flyer at the store. She wanted to see the lady who made the program for parents like me." Avery laughed, a sound filled with both relief and emotion. "Then I am glad she convinced you." Sophie tugged at Avery's sleeve. "Miss Avery, Daddy said you help people like us. Does that mean you are our boss now?" Avery knelt to her level, smiling warmly. "No, sweetheart, it means we are friends." Sophie grinned and ran off to chase a balloon. Ethan's voice was quiet when he spoke again. "You did something good, Avery. Guess you did not lose yourself after all." She looked at him, her eyes glistening. "Maybe I just finally found where I belong." He offered a small smile. "You always did. You just needed reminding." Avery reached into her purse and pulled out the silver locket. She placed it gently in his hand. "It should stay with the person who helped me find my way back." Ethan hesitated, then closed his hand around it. "Are you sure?" "I am," she said softly, "because what you gave me was worth more than anything inside that locket." The air between them felt lighter, as if the months of silence had folded into this single moment. Outside, the crowd cheered as the foundation banner unfurled. Avery looked toward the noise, then back at Ethan. "Would you and Sophie like to stay for dinner?" He chuckled. "Only if you promise not to cook," she smiled. "Deal." As the sun dipped behind the skyline, Avery realized something she had long forgotten: real strength was not built in boardrooms but in the quiet courage to be human again. The dinner invitation turned into something more than any of them had expected. What began as a simple meal at a quiet restaurant near the harbor slowly became a tradition. Every Thursday evening, Ethan and Sophie would join Avery for dinner after her foundation meetings, and each week the distance between their worlds seemed to shrink a little more. Ethan, who had always felt out of place in the city, found himself laughing freely in her company. Avery, who once measured her life in numbers and profit charts, began to measure it in moments: the sound of Sophie's giggles, the smell of coffee shared late at night, and the peace that came when the three of them sat together as if they had always belonged that way. One chilly evening in November, Avery invited them to her penthouse for the first time. Sophie gasped the moment she stepped inside. "It is like a castle," she said, spinning around as the city lights glittered through the glass walls. Ethan smiled awkwardly. "Do not get used to it, kiddo. We have our cabin, remember?" Avery laughed softly. "It is only a place, Ethan. What matters is the people inside it." She knelt beside Sophie. "Do you want to help me decorate for Christmas?" Sophie's eyes lit up. "Yes. Daddy says we have a tiny tree, but this one is huge." The next few hours were filled with laughter, tangled lights, and stories. For the first time in years, Avery's home felt alive. Later that night, after Sophie had fallen asleep on the couch surrounded by tinsel, Avery and Ethan stepped out onto the balcony. The city stretched below them, glowing against the dark sky. "You know," Ethan said quietly, "I never thought I would end up here again. The last time I stood this high above the city, it was to fix a rooftop generator." Avery smiled. "And now you are helping me fix my life. Seems fair." He looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "You have done more for people in 1 month than most companies do in a lifetime. But I have to ask, are you doing it for them or for yourself?" She met his gaze without hesitation. "Both," she admitted, "because helping others helps me remember who I want to be." The wind lifted her hair, carrying the scent of pine and cold air. For a moment neither of them spoke. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out the locket she had given him. "You gave this back to me," he said, "but it belongs with you." He opened his hand, the silver catching the city lights. Avery looked down, her eyes soft. "No, Ethan, it belongs to the story that saved us both." He hesitated, then closed his hand around it again, understanding without another word. Days turned into weeks, and their bond deepened quietly. Avery visited the mountain cabin with them one weekend, trading her heels for boots and her schedule for silence. They repaired the fence, made pancakes, and walked by the frozen creek. Sophie ran ahead, her laughter echoing between the trees. "It is beautiful here," Avery said, her breath visible in the cold air. "I forgot the world could be this simple." Ethan smiled. "That is the secret. The world only feels complicated when you stop paying attention." They stood there for a long moment, the quiet around them thick with peace. Later that night, by the fire, Avery spoke softly. "Ethan, I have been offered a position on the state's Economic Council. It would mean expanding the foundation, reaching more families." He nodded slowly. "That is good news." "It is," she said, "but it also means traveling a lot, being away again." He looked into the fire. "You do what you were meant to do. Just do not disappear again." She smiled faintly. "I will not. Not unless you stop making pancakes." He laughed quietly, and the tension faded into warmth. Before leaving the cabin the next morning, Avery placed a small envelope on the table. Inside was a deed not to her name, but his. It transferred ownership of the cabin and surrounding land to Ethan and Sophie. When he found it after she left, his eyes widened. Scribbled at the bottom was a note in her handwriting. A real home should belong to the ones who built its heart. Months later, as the foundation grew nationwide, Avery kept her promise. She never lost herself again. And every weekend, no matter how far she traveled, she returned to that cabin, where laughter and love waited by the fire. The woman who once cried, "Please, I am injured, I cannot walk," had found more than recovery. She had found family and a life worth standing for. Spring arrived quietly in the mountains, melting the last patches of snow outside the cabin. Avery stood by the window, holding a mug of coffee as the sun filtered through the trees. She had spent the last few months dividing her time between the foundation's new offices in the city and the cabin that had become her real home. Ethan was outside repairing the fence again, humming softly while Sophie played with a small puppy near the steps. The sound of laughter drifted through the air, and Avery smiled to herself. Life had settled into something beautifully ordinary. Yet, beneath the peace, a new challenge was waiting. One morning, Marcus arrived at the cabin unexpectedly, his car crunching over the gravel. He stepped out with a folder in hand and a worried expression. "Avery, I would not have come all the way out here if it were not important," he said. Ethan appeared on the porch, wiping his hands on a towel, his brow furrowed. Avery gestured for Marcus to come inside. "What is going on?" she asked. Marcus took a deep breath. "There has been an audit at Langford Group. Some of Derek's old partners are trying to frame you for corporate negligence. They have fabricated reports claiming that you mishandled company funds after his arrest." Avery felt her stomach drop. "That is ridiculous. We cleared all of that with the investigators months ago." "I know," Marcus said, "but they are trying to push it through the courts. It could ruin your reputation if it gets out." Ethan watched the color drain from her face. "What do you need?" he asked. She looked between the two men, her voice steady despite the fear building inside her. "Evidence. Proof that they are lying. Marcus, start pulling everything you can from the archives. I will come to the city tomorrow." Ethan stepped closer. "You do not have to face this alone." Avery nodded, her resolve firm. "I know, but I have to face it head on." That night, she could not sleep. She sat by the fire, staring at the flames while Ethan poured her tea. "You do not have to be the one fixing everything all the time," he said gently. "You have already proven who you are." She shook her head. "Integrity is not proven once, Ethan. It is proven every day, especially when it costs you something." The next morning, Avery returned to the city. Reporters swarmed outside the Langford headquarters, their cameras flashing as she stepped from the car. She walked past them with quiet confidence, her team following close behind. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere was tense. The opposing lawyers presented their accusations with false politeness, but Avery met them with calm precision. She produced the audit trail, the official clearances, and the signatures that disproved every lie. "You underestimated me once before," she said coldly. "Do not make the same mistake again." By the end of the meeting, the accusations collapsed, and the conspirators were exposed. When she returned to the cabin that evening, the relief hit her like a wave. Sophie ran to her, hugging her tightly. "Daddy said you were saving the day again." Avery laughed, kneeling to hug the girl back. "Not saving the day, sweetheart, just keeping it honest." Ethan stood in the doorway, watching her with quiet admiration. "You did what you always do," he said. "You fought with grace." She smiled, tired, but content. "I had to. I promised you I would not lose myself again." They spent the evening sitting outside under a sky full of stars. Sophie had fallen asleep in her blanket, the puppy curled beside her. Avery leaned her head on Ethan's shoulder. "You know," she said softly, "I used to think strength meant standing alone. But maybe it means standing with the right people." Ethan's hand brushed hers. "And maybe it means letting someone stand with you." She turned to look at him, their eyes meeting in the golden flicker of the porch light. For a long moment, the only sound was the whisper of the wind through the trees. Then Avery smiled, a quiet certainty in her voice. "Ethan, I think this," she gestured toward the cabin, toward him, toward Sophie sleeping nearby, "is what real success looks like." He nodded. "It always was. You just needed to come home to see it." The night carried their laughter into the forest, soft and steady, like a promise kept between hearts that had finally found where they belonged. The days that followed felt like a calm after a long storm. For the first time in years, Avery did not wake up to the sound of alarms or urgent phone calls. She woke up to birdsong, to Sophie's laughter echoing down the hall, to the smell of pancakes and coffee coming from the kitchen. Ethan was at the stove, flipping pancakes with practiced ease. "You are getting good at this," she said with a teasing smile. He glanced over his shoulder. "You taught me to measure things properly. Turns out that works in the kitchen, too." She laughed softly, taking a seat at the small wooden table. Sophie ran over and wrapped her arms around Avery's waist. "Daddy says we are having a picnic today. Can we go by the lake?" Avery brushed the girl's hair from her face. "Of course, sweetheart. We will go right after breakfast." Later that afternoon, they drove down the winding road to the lake. The water glimmered under the sunlight, surrounded by trees just beginning to bloom. Ethan unpacked sandwiches and lemonade while Avery spread a blanket. Sophie chased the puppy along the shore, her giggles floating through the air. Avery sat back, her toes brushing the cool grass, and watched the two people who had unknowingly saved her life. "You look like you are finally breathing again," Ethan said, handing her a drink. She nodded. "I think I am. For so long, I was trying to prove something to my father, to the board, to the world. But here, I do not have to prove anything. I can just be." Ethan smiled faintly. "You earned that peace. You fought hard for it." She looked at him, her expression softening. "I would not have made it without you." He shrugged. "You would have. You just needed a reminder that you were more than what you owned." The wind rippled across the lake, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers. Avery turned her face toward the sun, her voice thoughtful. "You know, when I was lying there in that car crash, I thought it was the end, but maybe it was the beginning of the life I was supposed to have." Ethan reached over, brushing his thumb gently across her hand. "Sometimes life has to break us open before it can put us back together the right way." She smiled at that, her eyes glistening. "You always know what to say." "No," he said quietly. "You just finally learned how to listen." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching Sophie build a small tower of stones by the water's edge. When she looked back at them, she waved. "Mom! Dad! Look what I made!" The words slipped out so naturally that it took them both by surprise. Avery's breath caught. Ethan blinked, unsure if he had heard it right. Sophie beamed proudly. "I meant both of you," she said, running up to show them her tiny tower. Avery hugged her tightly, tears welling in her eyes. Ethan's hand rested gently on her back. "You okay?" he whispered. She nodded, unable to speak, her voice breaking into a quiet laugh. "More than okay." As the sun began to set, painting the lake in shades of gold and amber, Avery packed up the picnic basket. Ethan watched her, noticing how her movements had changed slower, gentler, free of the restless energy that had once consumed her. When everything was loaded into the truck, he turned to her. "There is something I need to ask you." Avery tilted her head. "What is it?" He took a small box from his jacket pocket and opened it. Inside was a simple silver ring, engraved with the words, "Second Chances." Avery's hand flew to her mouth. "Ethan?" He took a deep breath. "I do not have a mansion or a company. What I have is a home that is yours if you want it, a family that already loves you, and a heart that will not stop trying to make you smile. Will you marry me?" Tears slipped down Avery's cheeks as she laughed through them. "You really think you needed to ask?" She threw her arms around him, and he held her tightly as Sophie clapped and cheered beside them. The puppy barked as if in approval, and the lake reflected the moment like a painting. When they finally pulled apart, Avery whispered, "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger, his smile quiet and full of awe. "Looks like you found your forever boardroom, Miss Langford," she laughed, shaking her head. "No, Mr. Miller, I found my forever home." The wind carried their laughter across the lake as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the trees, sealing a promise that had begun on a stormy night when a stranger stopped to help a woman who could not walk, and together they had learned how to stand again. A gentle spring breeze swept across the valley on the day Avery and Ethan were married. The ceremony was small, just as they both wanted it to be, held by the lake where everything had quietly begun again. Sophie scattered white petals along the wooden path, her laughter mingling with the sound of birds overhead. The guests were a mix of two world's workers from Ethan's repair shop, volunteers from Avery's foundation, and a few close friends who had seen them through their hardest seasons. There were no flashing cameras, no lavish decorations, just sunlight, fresh air, and love that felt honest. Avery stood by the water in a simple ivory dress, her hair braided with tiny wildflowers Sophie had picked that morning. Ethan walked toward her in a dark suit that fit him awkwardly but perfectly, his hands trembling just slightly. When their eyes met, everything else faded. The officiant smiled warmly. Avery Langford and Ethan Miller, two people from different roads who found one path together. "Today, you make your promises before those who love you." Avery's voice was steady but full of emotion. "Ethan, when you found me that night, I had lost more than my way. I had lost myself. You did not see a CEO or a woman broken, you saw a person worth saving. You taught me that strength is not power, it is kindness, and that love is not control, it is grace." Ethan took her hands in his. "Avery, you came into my life like a storm, and somehow left it brighter. You reminded me that even after loss, there can still be light. I cannot promise you perfection, but I can promise to keep showing up, to fix what is broken, and to always come home to you." The officiant nodded. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." The moment their lips met, the guests erupted in applause. Sophie jumped up and down shouting, "They did it!" The puppy barked, and someone blew bubbles that floated into the sunlight. It was imperfect, beautiful, and completely theirs. Later, during the small reception, Marcus raised his glass. "To Avery and Ethan, who proved that when kindness leads, miracles follow." The crowd cheered, glasses clinking. Avery looked at Ethan, her heart full. "You know," she whispered, "for the first time in my life, I do not feel like I am chasing anything. I am exactly where I should be." He smiled, wrapping his arm around her. "That is because you finally stopped running from happiness." As the evening settled into soft twilight, Avery stood by the lake, watching the reflection of their little family in the rippling water. She felt a presence beside her Ethan, quiet as always. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how far we have come," she said, "and how a single act of kindness changed everything." He nodded. "Funny thing about kindness, it is the only investment that always multiplies." She laughed softly. "You sound like a businessman now." "I learned from the best," he teased. The stars began to appear one by one, dotting the darkening sky. Sophie ran up to them, barefoot and glowing with joy. "Mom, Dad, come dance," she said, pulling their hands toward the open space where fairy lights swayed in the breeze. Ethan chuckled. Who could say no to that? They danced slowly, barefoot in the grass, the three of them together. A picture of second chances and quiet redemption. The night ended with Avery resting her head on Ethan's shoulder as the last song played. "Thank you," she whispered, "for finding me." He kissed her forehead. "You were never really lost. You were just waiting for the right reason to come home." The camera of memory held on that image, the lake glowing with lantern light, Sophie twirling in the background, and two hearts that had finally learned that love is not about where you come from, but what you choose to build together. From that night on, people in the nearby town would often see them walking hand in hand along the lakeshore, the once injured CEO and the single dad who changed everything. And every time the wind brushed across the water, it carried a whisper of their story, a reminder that sometimes the greatest fortunes are found not in wealth or power, but in the courage to love again.